The NHL season is just about a month and a week away. Can you believe it? We are already almost to October. It's almost hockey time. What's going to happen during this Winnipeg Jets season? Let's chat about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I mentioned earlier on a previous episode, it's time to talk about the upcoming season. We are now past the point where I think we have a pretty good idea of what this roster on paper is going to look like. This is absent of any lineups, so we're heading into the season with a rough understanding of who's on the team and what is likely going to be your opening day sort of lineup, right? So with all that said, right, what is the season going to hold for the Jets? Because you came off of two well over 100-point seasons. One of them was the President's Trophy season. And out of all of that, you had 7 playoff wins between those two seasons. So on the one hand, a lot of success, but on the other hand, a lot of questions for this team. And this year's Jets team is going to be a lot different than last year's. I want to dive into all of the implications for this and what this team might do this upcoming season. But before we do, did want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So, let's talk a little bit about this Jets season, right? The last 2 years, the Jets have gotten at least 110 points. The first year, or like 2 years ago, we had 110 points. This past season, we had 116. And so you look at this Jets team and you think, well, I would say for this season, probably over 100 points. I don't think Winnipeg is likely to slip 5 full wins down further than where they were last year. But the thing about this season that's going to be a little funky is I think the regular season is going to be fine, but it's where the playoffs come into the picture that I have much bigger questions. And so this season feels like we're going to be looking at a lot of success driven by a couple of key things. The first is another Connor Hellebuyck Vezina year. Helly, the past couple of seasons, has only gotten better. I don't know how that's possible. I know that his workload on paper has actually reduced a bit because he hasn't faced nearly as many shots. But all that said, his body of work during the regular season is nigh untouchable. It doesn't matter how many shots he seems to face. The dude is just one of the greatest goalies to have ever hit the ice, right? We know that there are some questions about the playoff stuff, but at least in the regular season, when it comes to the Vezina form, there is zero question as to who you want in goal. It's always Hellebuyck, and that dude has been really an undeniable beast and workhorse for many seasons now. And so, however far the Jets go this year in the regular season, it's all going to be on his shoulders. And you have to think that you're going to get at least, fourth or third in the Central on the back of his performance. He has carried some really bad teams even to wild card spots, and this Jets team is very far from bad. They're pretty darn good. So even with the roster changes and the fact that, the Jets forward core has taken a bit of a hit, I still anticipate Winnipeg finishing at least 100 points, right? The other thing that I think is really going to be in Winnipeg's favor is the power play. The power play should still be very dangerous. Even guys like Nyquist can bring a really nice finishing touch to your man advantage. I think Taves will probably get some power play time if he's good enough and healthy enough to go. He still probably has some pretty good passing and vision. Maybe the skating isn't there like it used to be, but I still think a lot of the stuff up here and certainly with his hands are going to be plenty okay. So I'd anticipate him getting some time there, and I think that Jets power play under Davis Payne is going to continue to be very good. Now, here's the bit of the trick, right? So the 5v5 offense last year was solid. I don't think it was quite as good as people imagined it to be. it wasn't awful, but I think Winnipeg was a little more closer to break even than maybe a lot of fans realized. I didn't focus on it nearly as much just because, for most of the year, it wasn't really a big deal. But, when I talked a lot about the trade deadline being a disaster, there were some specific things that I was starting to think about heading into the postseason, and Winnipeg needing more creativity up front was one of the biggest things. The Jets, in some ways, have improved the finishing talent up and down the roster just a little bit, more so in the depth department. But the problem is that the rest of the stuff that you'd be looking for, like transition play, skating, that kind of stuff, definitely took a bit of a hit. You lost Steelers. Appleton was a competent bottom six guy. You replaced him with Pearson, Kepka, Taves, and Nyquist. And I think Taves probably has the most potential for success among all those four. I think Kepka will be a good fourth liner, but probably is going to be cycling more in the bottom, line. The fourth, I would think more than anything. Pearson, I don't really know what to expect from him. He can still punch the puck home pretty well. The rest of his game, though, has definitely declined as he's gotten older, which is not surprising. He's in his early 30s. He's really logged a lot of minutes across a lot of teams. And so, I look at the squad and I think the 5v5 offense, it's going to be able to punch some nice goals home, but I think it's going to see an overall step back in production and productivity. I still think this will be a good team, but maybe this is where we start talking about that 5-win differential. I don't know that it's going to happen necessarily. I feel like 5 wins is a lot to drop, but maybe it's more likely than I'm thinking right now. That's coming from like 110 points to 100. For the Jets, it would be from last season, right? You'd be talking something more like 8 wins difference if you were looking at last season and this upcoming year down to 100 points. That, again, seems a little bit much. I don't know that that's going to happen. And I don't think it's just because of the departures. I just feel like this team's defensive structure and the way that Winnipeg plays really is built to excel in the regular season. Arneal has a very good recipe for how to get into the playoffs, right? So you don't really worry about that. This Jets team, again, has been built for the grind and the grit of the regular season, which is kind of a shame that you don't get more recognition for that because in my mind, yeah, the playoffs are amazing and it's really one of the most unbelievable achievements when you win the cup. But when you really think about it, going through an 82-game, soon-to-be 84-game season, facing tons of different opponents all across the North American continent. I just don't know that, the playoffs should have that same level of prestige. I feel like a President's Trophy really should be one of the true prizes of the sport, kind of like, the Premier League trophy or something. But again, it's just not how it is. We know how playoffs are in North America. There's no use in trying to have that argument. So as it is, the Jets are probably going to be 100-point plus team. I think the challenge for them is that there are likely going to be a couple of teams up there in the top of the Central that are also going to be 100-plus point teams. That could make it really hard to get beyond third place. And I don't know if the Jets are going to necessarily climb all the way back up to the top of the Central, but I think at the very least, we're looking at a third or fourth place finish this season. That's what I've mentioned on previous episodes. I'm sticking with that. I think we will still have a very good team, but I do think that there's going to be some room for error here as we start off the season. But curious to know where you think the Jets finish. Drop your thoughts in comments below on either the YouTube comment section or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. One of the things, though, that I think is likely to help Winnipeg really succeed, and I want to talk about this a little more, is the team defensive structure and how Winnipeg can maybe rely on this a little bit more this upcoming season if the lack of foot speed becomes a bit of an issue. We'll chat about Winnipeg's blue line structure and how the overall team defends super well coming right up in a brief moment. But before we do, did want to shout out our friends and partners at Gametime. College football is back, and there's nothing better than the energy of tailgates and being in the stands with your fellow fans. The only downside? Trying to get tickets. Endless queues, hidden fees, and prices that jump at checkout. That's why I use Gametime, the app that gives the advantage back to fans. It's the easiest way to score last-minute tickets at the best prices with no surprise fees. What you see is what you pay. I've used Gametime to buy Ravens playoff tickets in the past couple of years, Super convenient. I had a panoramic seat view, and I was always guaranteed the lowest price possible. And they always have a lowest price guarantee backing you. So if you ever come across a better deal, they will give you 100% of the difference. But of course, you don't have to worry about that. You'll always see the upfront prices. It'll always be convenient, and your tickets will be delivered super fast. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets and go with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Download Gametime today. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us in tonight's episode as we are continuing our discussion of what's going on with Winnipeg's upcoming season and how this is ultimately going to be a little bit of a tricky year for the Jets, right? I have talked a little bit on and off about Winnipeg maybe having what you might call a transition year. It's a season that I thought maybe was going to happen last year. Winnipeg went veteran heavy instead. Now we are looking at, what could be an interesting step back season. Not one where I'd say the step back is necessarily going to be super apparent during the regular season, but maybe more so during the playoffs. That said, if Winnipeg wants to continue to have a really good shot at having a deep playoff run, one of the biggest things that really helped the Jets get there this past season, and really something that started to develop under the Bones era, was a very strong defensive backbone. Winnipeg's team, really from the ground up, defends well. Like, you look at all the forwards, many of them back check well, many of them man mark pretty well. Even Kyle Connor started back checking, and that level of commitment created more offense for the Jets. You know, the offensive production at 5v5, it wasn't anything that looked particularly special, but when you compare it to what happened at the end of Maurice's tenure, and even at times during the Bones era, I'd still say that we saw improvements under Arniel. Scott, I think, really got a lot of buy-in from the Jets forwards, and I think that overall just has a really positive impact on maintaining possession, winning the puck back, and getting the puck back up the ice in the area that matters the most. Scoring goals, right? You want it up in the offensive zone. Where I think the Jets do need to maybe work on some things, really to just try and squeeze more out of this lineup, is figuring out how to get more offense out of the back end. You know, your top two D pairings generally provide that. Is there more that you can get out of the third pairing? And I feel like the third pairing is where we always have this conversation. You know, the 5 and 6D technically don't play a lot on most teams, but you see a lot of other squads starting to balance those a little bit differently, right? If you don't have like a clear out and out best pairing, which that's not the case with the Jets. We do know which pairing is the best, and it's always going to be the one that's got Morrissey on it. But, you know, the Jets might do well giving themselves more puck moving support on the third D pairing. I know that that's not really their style, and I know that they traditionally like to have the bigger physical, more shutdowny types, but like, I think we've seen with Winnipeg where the margin for error tends to be very small. You start looking at, you know, the lack of foot speed on the third pairing, the lack of offensive production, and it's just one of those things where you keep getting cut, 1,000 little cuts eventually kill you somehow in a critical moment. Less so this past season, but in previous years that was a problem. I think during the playoffs, some of the death by 1,000 cut stuff did pop up, but there were just much bigger challenges, more towards the offense that I think, ended up sinking Winnipeg a little bit prematurely. But for the Jets, this defensive structure is something that I think really helped Hellebuck out, and it also helped out, a lot of the most dangerous chances really being nullified before opposing teams even got to them. There was one exception, though, and this is something where I think Winnipeg is going to want to work on this offseason. Probably have been a bit of a focus for the offseason training regimens and stuff, and maybe some of the upcoming camps and preseason. It's the screenshot stuff. Now, Winnipeg, for whatever reason, really struggles with screenshots. I don't know why this has been a thing for the past couple of years. Hellebuck, in particular, has had a horrendous time dealing with them, and some of those screens and tips aren't really things that he can even stop. A lot of them come at really sharp angles or right in front of him in areas where he can't really adjust in time because that's not his style. He's very much a prediction-based goalie, right? Big, strong, not particularly explosive laterally, and so that requires him to have um, a really heads up read of where the shooter is going to be taking the shot from, trying to predict as much as possible, and setting ahead of that shot attempt to try and cut down the angle. Right, every goalie does this, but I think for Hellebuck in particular, it's especially important because he's meant to soak up shots and be that big guy in net, rather than somebody who's kind of making the last ditch explosive save. And it's not like Helly never does this, but it's not his style, right? You look at Bobrovsky, you look at some of those other cup winning goaltenders. Those guys have incredible reflexes, ridiculous stretches. You think about the Vasilevskis of the world. Uh, there does seem to be something stylistically as to why those teams tend to have goalies that go deeper. And I wonder if that's something Winnipeg can try and figure out a way to counter, right? If it's tipped screens and stuff that continue to be a problem, maybe the defensive structure needs to adjust for that a bit better. Winnipeg struggled to do that during the postseason, and I think the Blues almost got them out on that stuff alone, which is pretty crazy. Dallas didn't rely upon it nearly as much, but they still got through anyways. So, you know, it's not the only thing that the Jets have to fix, but I do feel like that's been really for the past couple of years one of the big Achilles heels. We've seen, compared to like just regular open play goals versus tipped and screen stuff, a huge disparity in what the Jets give up in the playoffs. So uh, if there's a really big moment for focus, maybe that's one of them. It's not going to be a thing that maybe pops up as much during the regular season, but if you're facing a team like the Blues in the playoffs where it gets really scrappy, goals come at a premium, and teams are really fighting for traffic in front of the slot, that could be something that Winnipeg wants to take a closer look at. Not the only thing, again, that you should focus on, but it's really one of the only weaknesses that I can really point to outside of just, clearing the puck out of the D zone. That aspect of the game, I don't know if the Jets can necessarily fix without changing personnel. And I feel like they feel their personnel is pretty good as is. I think this year's going to be a very interesting test of that. Appleton was defensively pretty decent. So if you swap him out maybe for an older and slower forward, you might see a bit of a reduction. We also don't really know what Lowry's going to be like, and Lowry is a very key aspect of Winnipeg winning its bottom six matchups against opposing bottom lines. That helps kind of catalyze more support for the top six. And so if he's not 100% and he's not really able to do a lot of that two-way work like he used to, I just don't know what it means for the overall team structure. Winnipeg has, in many ways, a little bit of a rigid system, and because of that, if any one part of it stops working, that does tend to make a lot of the rest of the components function not at 100%. So, going to be an interesting conversation to have. I don't know if it's going to be an issue through the first couple of months. We'll have to wait and see. I don't really know what to expect from the season. This year I feel very unsure of anything, which I don't mind because to some degree, changing things up, shaking things up isn't the worst. And I've often said that I feel like Winnipeg needs to do something to add an extra level of talent. And if you have a retooling season where you give kids more experience, you maybe go through a bit of a rougher patch, and perhaps you come out with a better prospect than you usually do in the draft, I don't think that that's a failure of a season. You might even still be able to squeak into the playoffs and have a decent run if you play your cards right. So there are so many options on the table, and I don't think the Jets have necessarily precluded themselves from anything right now, which, if you're going to start off the year with a lot of question marks, probably the best way to do it. We still don't even have a Kyle Connor contract extension announcement yet, which is one of the biggest things heading into this upcoming season that I feel Winnipeg absolutely has to have some sort of an answer on. If they don't get him re-signed and they go into the season and get to the point where, it's the trade deadline and they don't have him under contract, they're not in a playoff spot, you potentially have one of the biggest franchise decision points to make, because if he tests free agency, it could end very badly for the Jets. So, yeah, this year feels like there's a lot riding on it, man. There are so many different things that could happen, so many ways that this could all go really well or go really poorly. And one of those things that I've sort of talked a lot about is where I feel like the Jets continue to be weak in the playoffs. I wanted to focus in a little bit more on why the postseason continues to be a challenge and how the Jets might be able to get themselves out of that hole in just a little bit. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us in today's episode, as we're just chatting a little bit about Winnipeg ultimately needing to make some decisions heading into, this upcoming season. That's going to be what feels to be a transition year, right? And I don't think Winnipeg would ever come out and say it, but it does feel like this year, I wouldn't call it a write-off, but I do think Winnipeg is not throwing all of its investments and assets into it just yet. It does feel like the Jets are waiting a little bit to see how things shake out before they start sinking a lot into it. A lot of the biggest trades may have already happened. We haven't really seen a lot of off-season movement, despite, all these hockey insiders telling us that there was going to be a ton of trades. Not much has really happened since the start of free agency. So with that in mind, the Jets kind of are looking to be what they are heading into the regular season. And if that's the case, Winnipeg as is not constructed to win in the postseason. It's just not. Last year's team, I think, got closer than we've seen in many years. And even then, Winnipeg came very close to losing in the first round, and it required a miraculous moment to get them to the second round against the Stars, where they only won 2 games and then proceeded to watch the Stars get eviscerated by Edmonton. So clearly the Jets have a talent differential issue, and we all knew that. We've talked about it a lot. It's not a secret, but I continue to say that the Jets can still win by committee. I really do believe that. I think Winnipeg has exceptional advantages in other areas, and Winnipeg isn't doing enough to support those advantages with a more competent forward group. And it's hard to, right? The Jets have some recruitment challenges. No one will ever deny that. I do think Winnipeg needs to adjust who it targets in trades, just because I feel like, they keep going for all of these guys with trade protection, and so many of them have turned Winnipeg down. Maybe it's time to go elsewhere, right? You look at guys who maybe fill more middle six roles, and look, they might not look impressive on paper, but maybe there's something in their statistical profile that can help you find a player who's an underrated gem, somebody who can take on more responsibility and help kind of better balance out your top 9. For me, I think that continues to be the biggest thing. You need guys who can help you win more matchups. I don't think as many lines on Winnipeg's roster win their 5v5 matchups as people believe them to. The Lowry line generally wins its matchups. The second line with Ehlers used to at times. The top line was kind of like 50-50. The fourth line generally won its minutes, but I wouldn't say that there was a lot of, high-end 5v5 offense coming out of those victories, right? The Lowry line probably won your majority of your matchups, and they didn't really score. The top line probably scored a decent amount and certainly played a lot together, but didn't exactly drive play at an elite level. Your second line could occasionally do it, but it was very inconsistent. So you really need more consistency. You need more matchup winning ability, and you need to be able to hem opponents in the offensive zone. That's a very tall order. And I think Winnipeg has a lot of components that can help them do that, but they still need that high-end center and really another winger now to kind of reach that next level. We've seen what the Florida Panthers did and how elite they are, and the Jets are not really in that same tier. But they do have the world's best goalie. They've got one of the best defensemen in the league, and they've got a very strong foundation up front that I think you can build on. So if the Jets really want to go deep in the postseason, this is where you want to look at, as teams are heading into the season, who's disgruntled? Who wants a change of scenery? Is there an opportunity to make a trade? You have a fair few assets. Maybe you don't have the world's top-ranked prospect pool, but you've got your firsts. You've got some pretty good prospects in guys like Lambert, Barlow, etc. If there's a play to be made, and if there's a way to bring in a really big player that maybe another team feels, is expendable, but the Jets can certainly use, have that conversation, right? Be aggressive this year. This is a chance for you to get into it a little earlier than the trade deadline, maybe, and perhaps it puts you on a better path through the second half of the season. I don't think you have to wait till the end of the TDL to make that deal. If you're the Jets and you're really serious about trying to win the Cup in the next 3 years, you have to be more aggressive. There's just no getting around it. Your TDL was disappointing. I'd argue the summer has been a little disappointing. You've got to find a way to add some real high-end talent. I think going into the postseason, again, with a very similar roster to this, is just not going to get you to the promised land. we've seen, lesser versions of teams do it. You've seen the Caps when they were not as good win the cup, but that team still had a stronger foundation in my mind than what Winnipeg is working with right now. So, all that to say, Winnipeg's playoff odds to make the postseason are relatively high, but going deep past the first round, very low. I think they could win the first round and maybe win a couple games in the second round, but you'd really have to hope that you'd have good home seating, and I just don't really think that's going to be the case this year. I think the Jets are going to have to win more on the road to start, and if they do, maybe that puts them in better straits, but like we saw how it was for them on the road last year, not exactly a winning formula. So, the Jets, I love them. I think that they've done a lot really well over the past couple of years, but if they want to go deep in the playoffs, they have got to make some roster improvements. This team, as is, just isn't going to be good enough. And, for all of the regular season success, at some point, the focus is unfortunately on the playoffs. It's on the cup run, and that's really the last hurdle the Jets have to clear. They've done just about everything else you could possibly imagine. Won the division, won the Central, they've won the conference and the league. You got to find a way to turn that into some real playoff success. At this point, we're seeing the heydays of Scheifele and Hellebuck move on into the past, right? And Hellebuck is still giving you Vezina seasons, but how many more of those will you have? So, curious to know your thoughts on this. Do you feel like the Jets are going to make the necessary moves to be a true champion? Let me know in the comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. Before we go, just wanted to let you know about another big moment on Locked On. College football fans, Locked On and Fire TV present College Football Kickoff, your ultimate college football weekly preview. Drake Toll of Locked On Big 12 leads the conversation alongside two-time AP Coach of the Year Gary Patterson, former college star Jesse Holley, and Locked On's local experts. A college football preview only Locked On can do. Catch College Football Kickoff every Thursday throughout the season, only on Fire TV. As always, thank you so much for listening. Have a great night, and go Jets, go.